The first pale light of dawn crept across the Arizona territory like a cautious animal, casting long shadows from the saguaro cacti that dotted Samuel McKenna's property. The air hung still and cool, a brief reprieve before the desert sun would turn the land into a furnace. Samuel had been awake since before sunrise, as was his habit. Sleep came fitfully these days, haunted by memories of Margaret's laughter echoing through rooms now too quiet. He pulled on his worn leather boots and stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The coffee tin was nearly empty again, another reminder of how little he'd been eating or caring for himself since the fever took his wife 2 winters past. At 43, Samuel felt decades older, his once broad shoulders now bearing the weight of loneliness like a heavy yoke. The horses should have been nickering for their morning feed by now, but the corral stood empty. Samuel's jaw tightened as he stared at the broken fence rails. The 3rd time this month his animals had been stolen. The Apache raids had increased since the government moved more of their people to the reservations, desperation driving both young warriors seeking to prove themselves and families simply trying to survive. He was about to turn back inside when movement near his cabin door caught his eye. A figure crouched there, small and dark against the weathered wood, moving with deliberate precision. Samuel's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip, then stopped. The figure was too small to be a threat, barely more than a child. "Hey there!" Samuel called out, his voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing to my door?" The figure froze, then slowly turned. It was indeed a child, a girl maybe 14 years old, with long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders and dark eyes that held more wariness than fear. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache dress and white man's clothing, a calico skirt torn at the hem, a cotton blouse that had seen better days, and moccasins that looked handmade. In her right hand, she held what appeared to be a piece of red ochre. "I paint protection for you," she said in careful English, her accent thick but her words clear. "You gave water to my grandmother when she was dying. She told me to remember the white man with kind eyes." Samuel stepped closer, studying the symbols she'd painted on his door. They were intricate designs in red and white, spirals and lines that seemed to flow like water, birds in flight, and what looked like horses running. The artistry was remarkable, each symbol precise and meaningful. "Your grandmother?" Samuel asked, his voice softer now. "When was this?" 3 summers ago, during the Great Drought. She was walking to find water for our people when she fell sick. You found her by your well." The girl's eyes searched his face. "You gave her water from your gourd. You sat with her until she passed to the next world." The memory came flooding back, an elderly Apache woman, her weathered face creased with pain, who had collapsed near his property line. He'd found her while checking his fence line, delirious with fever and thirst. Samuel had given her water, made her comfortable in the shade of his barn, and stayed with her through her final hours. He'd even buried her properly, marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. "I remember," Samuel said quietly. "She spoke of her granddaughter before she died. Said she was worried about you." Tears gathered in the girl's dark eyes. "I am Aiyana. It means eternal blossom. My grandmother was Maria Crow Feather. She said you had a good heart, even though our people and your people—" She gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the complex hatred and fear that existed between their worlds. Samuel looked at the symbols again, understanding dawning. "These are protective symbols." "Yes. For your home, your animals, your spirit." "My grandmother taught me the old ways before the white teachers took me to the school." Her voice hardened with the last word, and Samuel noticed the way she unconsciously rubbed her wrists, as if remembering restraints. "You escaped from the boarding school." Aiyana nodded, her chin lifting with defiance. "They cut my hair, made me wear their clothes, said my language was evil, my beliefs were savage. They wanted to kill the Apache in me." She touched the symbols on the door. "But my grandmother's spirit lives here still. She told me in a dream to find you, to paint protection for the man who honored her death." Samuel felt something twist in his chest, not the familiar ache of loss, but something else. Purpose, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit, who understood what it meant to be alone in a harsh world. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked. 2 moons. "I live in the mountains, hunt small game, gather roots and berries. I remember what my grandmother taught me before they took me away." She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. "The symbols are finished. Your horses will return." As if summoned by her words, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon to the east. Samuel shaded his eyes and squinted into the growing daylight. Sure enough, his 3 horses were trotting toward the homestead, their reins trailing in the dust. His bay mare Duchess whinnied as she approached, followed by the 2 geldings he used for ranch work. "How did you—" Samuel began, then stopped. The girl was already backing away, preparing to disappear into the desert scrub as silently as she'd appeared. "Wait," Samuel called out. "Aiyana, wait!" She paused, her body tense like a deer ready to bolt. "You're welcome to stay," Samuel said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "I mean, if you need a place to rest, to eat a proper meal, I've got beans and cornbread, coffee if you want it." Aiyana studied his face for a long moment, those dark eyes seeming to peer into his soul. "You would do this? Even though your people and mine are enemies?" "Your grandmother wasn't my enemy," Samuel replied simply. "And neither are you." The girl's expression softened slightly. "I will stay for 1 meal, but if other white men come, I will disappear like morning mist." Samuel nodded, understanding the precarious position she was in. A runaway Apache girl would be seen as a threat by most settlers, something to be returned to the authorities or driven off at gunpoint. But looking at her now, seeing the skill with which she'd painted the symbols and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, Samuel saw only a child trying to honor her grandmother's memory while preserving what remained of her heritage. "Come on then," he said, turning toward the cabin. "Let's get some food in you." As they walked toward the door, Samuel couldn't help but notice how the painted symbols seemed to glow in the early morning light, and how his horses had indeed returned just as the girl had said they would. Whether through coincidence or something deeper, he couldn't say. But for the first time in 2 years, Samuel McKenna felt like he wasn't completely alone in the world. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of a hawk's cry. Change was coming to the McKenna homestead, and Samuel found himself oddly grateful for it. The interior of Samuel's cabin reflected the life of a man who'd stopped caring about anything beyond mere survival. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Margaret's rocking chair sat in the corner, still draped with the quilt she'd been working on before the fever took her. Samuel had avoided looking at it for so long that seeing it through Aiyana's eyes made him suddenly ashamed of how he'd let everything deteriorate. Aiyana stood just inside the doorway, her dark eyes taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to assess potential dangers quickly. She noticed the rifle above the fireplace, the way Samuel's shoulders hunched when he moved past his wife's chair, the photograph on the mantel of a smiling woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. "Your wife," Aiyana said, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Margaret," Samuel replied, his voice catching slightly on the name. "She died 2 winters ago. Fever came through the territory that year. Took a lot of folks." Aiyana nodded solemnly. "My grandmother said the spirits sometimes call our loved ones home early to prepare the way for us. It does not make the loneliness less sharp." Samuel paused in lighting the wood stove, struck by the girl's matter-of-fact wisdom. At 14, she'd already faced more loss and hardship than many adults would in a lifetime. Yet she spoke of death with an acceptance that came from her people's deep connection to the cycles of life. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Samuel said, gesturing to the rough-hewn table where he took his solitary meals. "I'll get some food started." Aiyana remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her. "In my grandmother's house, guests help prepare the meal. It shows respect and builds trust between people." Samuel considered this, then nodded. "All right then, you can help if you want." He pulled out a bag of dried beans and a chunk of salt pork from his meager stores. "It's not much, but it's filling." As they worked together in the small kitchen area, an unexpected ease settled between them. Aiyana's movements were precise and economical. She knew her way around food preparation, clearly having learned from her grandmother before the boarding school tried to erase such knowledge. She sorted through the beans with quick fingers, removing stones and damaged pieces, while Samuel sliced the salt pork. "The school," Samuel said carefully, not wanting to pry but sensing she needed to talk about it. "How long were you there?" 4 years, Aiyana replied, her voice tightening. "They took me when I was 10, said my grandmother was too old to care for me properly, that I needed to learn civilized ways." She spat the last words like they tasted bitter. "They gave me a white name, Alice Morrison, made me answer only to Alice." Samuel's hands stilled on the knife. "Morrison? Like Sheriff Morrison in town?" "His brother. Thomas Morrison runs the school." Aiyana's knuckles whitened as she gripped a handful of beans. "He believes Apache children are like wild animals that can be tamed with enough discipline." We were beaten for speaking our language, for practicing our customs, for even thinking Apache thoughts. The rage in her voice was carefully controlled, but Samuel could see the fire burning behind her dark eyes. He'd heard stories about the boarding schools, of course, how Indian children were forced to cut their hair, wear white clothing, and abandon everything that connected them to their heritage. But hearing it from someone who'd lived through it made the reality hit him like a physical blow. "How did you escape?" he asked. A ghost of a smile crossed Aiyana's face. "They thought they had broken my spirit. I learned to be very quiet, very obedient. I answered to Alice, wore their clothes, repeated their prayers. But at night, I would whisper my real name to myself. I would remember my grandmother's stories, practice drawing the sacred symbols in the dirt behind the dormitory." She moved to the window and gazed out at the desert landscape. 3 moons ago, they took us on a trip to the new railway station to see the marvels of civilization. While the other children were watching the train, I slipped away. I had been planning for months, hiding small pieces of food, studying the land around the school. Weren't they looking for you? Didn't they send search parties? They did, for a while. But I know the desert like they know their books. My grandmother taught me which plants give water, which rocks provide shelter, how to read the signs that tell of weather changes. Aiyana's voice carried quiet pride. I became invisible, like smoke in the wind. Samuel stirred the beans, processing what she'd told him. The girl had survived completely on her own for months, in some of the harshest country in the territory. Most grown men wouldn't last a week alone in the desert, yet she'd not only survived, but thrived enough to help others, like returning his horses. "The symbols you painted," he said. "Your grandmother taught you those too." "Yes, but not all of them. Some came to me in dreams." Aiyana returned to the table, resuming her work with the beans. "My grandmother said I had the gift, the ability to see the connections between all living things, to understand what the spirits want us to know." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Samuel moved quickly to the window and peered out. 3 riders were coming up the trail to his cabin, and even at a distance he could make out the tin star glinting on the lead rider's vest. "Sheriff Morrison," Samuel muttered, then turned to Aiyana. "You need to hide, now." But the girl was already moving, her survival instincts kicking in. She gathered her few possessions and headed for the back door. "If they ask about the symbols, tell them vandals painted them. Say you found them this morning and don't know who did it." "Wait," Samuel called softly. "Will you come back?" Aiyana paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "The symbols I painted will protect you for 7 days. If you still want me to return after that, leave a white cloth tied to your gate post. I will know you are friend, not enemy." "I'll leave the cloth," Samuel said without hesitation. She nodded once, then slipped out the back door just as the sheriff's boots hit the front porch. Samuel quickly moved the extra bowl and cup he'd set out for Aiyana, made it look like he'd been preparing breakfast for one. His heart was pounding, but his hands remained steady. The knock on the door was sharp and authoritative. "McKenna, open up!" Samuel took a deep breath and opened the door. Sheriff Morrison stood there with 2 deputies, all 3 men looking grim and determined. Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with grey whiskers and cold blue eyes that never seemed to hold any warmth. "Morning, Sheriff," Samuel said evenly. "What brings you out this way so early?" "Looking for a runaway Indian girl," Morrison replied, pushing past Samuel into the cabin without invitation. "About 14 years old, probably wearing a mix of white and Apache clothing. Goes by the name Alice. Least that's her Christian name." Samuel's jaw tightened at the casual way Morrison dismissed the girl's real name, but he kept his voice neutral. "Haven't seen anyone like that. You boys want some coffee? Just put a pot on." Morrison's eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail. "Funny thing, McKenna, got reports of someone seen in this area early this morning. And what's this mess on your door?" Samuel followed the sheriff outside, where Morrison was staring at Aiyana's painted symbols with obvious disgust. "Found that this morning when I got up. Looks like vandals hit during the night, probably kids from town playing pranks." "This isn't vandalism," one of the deputies said, a younger man named Peters. "These are Apache symbols. I've seen them before on rocks near the reservation." Morrison's expression darkened. "Someone's been here all right. Someone who knows Apache ways." He turned to Samuel with suspicious eyes. "You sure you haven't seen this girl? She's dangerous, McKenna. Been living wild like an animal for months, no telling what diseases she might be carrying or what kind of savage behavior she might resort to." "I told you, I haven't seen anyone," Samuel replied firmly. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your speculations to yourself. If there's a lost child in the area, I hope you find her and get her somewhere safe." Morrison stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Don't get any fool ideas about helping runaways, McKenna. That girl belongs in the school where she can learn proper civilization. Anyone who helps her avoid her rightful place will be considered an accessory to her crimes." "What crimes?" Samuel asked. "Being 14 and scared. Theft, for starters. She's been stealing food from farms and camps all across the territory, and there's the matter of her escaping lawful custody." Morrison straightened his vest. "Just remember what I said, McKenna. Mind your own business and everything will be fine." The three men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Samuel standing alone on his porch. He waited until they were completely out of sight, then walked to his gate and tied a strip of white cloth from an old shirt to the post. The painted symbols on his door seemed to glow brighter in the morning sun, and for the first time in 2 years, Samuel McKenna felt like he was part of something larger than his own grief and loneliness. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. 3 days passed before Aiyana returned, and Samuel found himself checking the horizon more often than he cared to admit. The white cloth fluttered from his gatepost like a flag of truce in a war neither side fully understood. He'd spent those days cleaning his cabin properly for the first time since Margaret's death, though he told himself it was just restlessness and had nothing to do with the Apache girl who'd painted symbols on his door. She appeared at sunset on the 3rd day, materializing from the desert scrub like a shadow given form. Samuel was mending harness leather on his porch when he looked up to find her standing at the edge of his property, studying the white cloth with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You kept your word," Aiyana said as she approached, her voice carrying a note of surprise that made Samuel's chest tighten. How many promises had been broken to this child that his simple gesture should seem remarkable? "I always keep my word," Samuel replied, setting down his leatherwork. "Are you hungry? I've got stew on the stove." Aiyana nodded, but her attention was focused on something beyond the cabin. She tilted her head, listening to sounds Samuel couldn't hear, her body tense with alertness. "What is it?" Samuel asked, following her gaze toward the mountains. "My brother," she said quietly. "He searches for me. He and 3 others. They have been watching this place since yesterday." Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but Aiyana shook her head. "They will not attack unless they believe you mean me harm, but they are concerned about my choice to trust a white man." "Maybe you should go to them," Samuel suggested, though the words felt like swallowing stones. "Be with your own people." Aiyana's expression hardened. "Naalnish wishes to take me back to the reservation, to live as a prisoner of the government. He thinks it is safer than living wild, but he does not understand. On the reservation, my spirit will die as surely as my body would die in the desert without water." She moved closer to the cabin, her movements fluid and cautious. "I told him about the symbols I painted for you, about how you honored our grandmother's passing. He thinks you may be different from other white men, but trust does not come easily to my people. We have been betrayed too many times." As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from behind a large boulder about 200 yards away. Even at that distance, Samuel could see the man was tall and lean with long black hair and traditional Apache clothing. He stood motionless, watching the cabin with the patience of a hunter. "That's Naalnish?" Samuel asked. "Yes, my brother by blood and by choice. He has protected me since our parents died in the massacre at Bear Canyon 5 winters ago." Aiyana's voice carried old pain. "The soldiers said it was a mistake, that they thought our camp was hostile. But mistakes that kill children and elders are hard to forgive." Samuel felt a familiar rage building in his chest. He'd heard about Bear Canyon, though the official reports had been sanitized to make it sound like a legitimate military action against renegade Apache warriors. The reality, whispered in saloons and around campfires, was that nervous soldiers had opened fire on a peaceful camp, killing mostly women, children, and elderly people. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, meaning it. "That should never have happened." Aiyana studied his face, searching for deception or false sympathy. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and continued toward the cabin. "Naalnish raised me after that, taught me to hunt, to track, to read the signs that keep us alive. When the government agents came to take me to school, he tried to hide me. But there were too many soldiers, and they threatened to arrest him as well." They reached the porch, and Samuel opened the cabin door for her. The simple courtesy seemed to surprise her again, another small indication of how she'd been treated by white authority figures. "He blames himself for not protecting me," Aiyana continued as they entered the cabin. Now he wants to make up for it by keeping me safe, even if it means caging me on the reservation. Samuel ladled stew into 2 bowls, the rich smell of beef and vegetables filling the small space. What do you want? To be free, Aiyana said without hesitation. To practice the old ways my grandmother taught me, to paint the sacred symbols, to speak my language without fear, to honor the spirits of my ancestors without being told I am a savage. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, but Samuel could feel the weight of watching eyes from the mountains. Every so often, Aiyana would glance toward the window, and he knew she was thinking about her brother's vigil. How long will he wait out there? Samuel asked finally. Until he is satisfied that I am safe, or until he decides you are a threat that must be eliminated. Aiyana's matter-of-fact tone made the threat all the more chilling. Naalnish is a good man, but he has killed white men before when they threatened our people. It would pain him to do so again, but he would not hesitate if he thought it necessary. Samuel set down his spoon, studying the girl across from him. She was warning him, he realized, giving him a chance to understand the stakes involved in sheltering her. What would convince him I'm not a threat? Samuel asked. Time, Aiyana replied, and perhaps understanding. My brother speaks some English, though he pretends not to when white men are around. If you were willing to meet with him, to let him see who you truly are. Before Samuel could respond, a sharp whistle echoed from the mountains. 3 quick notes, followed by a longer one. Aiyana's head snapped up, her body going rigid with alarm. What does that mean? Samuel asked. Danger. Other riders approaching from the east. Aiyana was already moving, gathering her few possessions. Many horses, moving fast. Samuel went to the window and squinted into the gathering dusk. Sure enough, a dust cloud was rising from the trail that led to town, and the thunder of hoofbeats was growing louder by the moment. Sheriff Morrison? Samuel muttered. But why would he come back so soon and with so many men? Aiyana's face had gone pale. Someone must have seen me coming here, or perhaps they found tracks I thought I had hidden. She looked toward the back door, then stopped. There is no time. They will surround the cabin before I can reach cover. The sound of horses was very close now. Samuel counted at least 6, maybe more. Through the window he could see torches flickering in the darkness, their orange light casting dancing shadows across the desert landscape. The root cellar, Samuel said suddenly. Behind the cabin, under the storm doors. You can hide there until they leave. But Aiyana shook her head. If they search and find me, it will go worse for you. They will say you are hiding a dangerous fugitive. She straightened her shoulders. Decision made. I will not bring that shame upon the man who honored my grandmother. Like hell you will, Samuel said firmly. You're under my protection now, and I don't abandon people who trust me. The horses were in his yard now, their riders shouting orders to surround the property. Samuel could hear Morrison's voice among them, loud and aggressive. But there were other voices too, ones he didn't recognize. Aiyana moved to the window and peered out carefully. What she saw made her draw back with a sharp intake of breath. Not just sheriff's men, she whispered. Bounty hunters, and Thomas Morrison, the man who ran the school. Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. Bounty hunters meant they weren't planning to simply return a runaway student to custody. They were treating this like a hunt for a dangerous criminal, with all the violence that implied. McKenna! Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the yard. We know she's in there. Send the girl out and nobody has to get hurt. Samuel looked at Aiyana, seeing his own determination reflected in her dark eyes. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The painted symbols on his door might offer spiritual protection, but the real test was about to begin. Stay away from the windows, Samuel told her quietly, then called out to the men surrounding his cabin. I don't know what you're talking about, Morrison. There's nobody here but me. A harsh laugh answered him from the darkness. We'll see about that, McKenna. We'll see about that. The sound of rifle bolts being worked echoed through the night air, and Samuel knew their time for peaceful solutions had just run out. In the mountains, another whistle sounded, longer this time, with an urgency that made Aiyana's eyes widen with both hope and fear. Naalnish and his warriors were coming. The standoff stretched through the long desert night like a taut wire ready to snap. Samuel kept his rifle ready, while Aiyana moved with silent grace between the windows, tracking the positions of the men surrounding the cabin. Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice carried the authority of law and the threat of violence in equal measure. You're harboring a dangerous fugitive, McKenna, Morrison called out. This is your last chance to do the right thing. Samuel's jaw clenched. Through the window he could see the sheriff positioned behind his horse, using the animal as cover. 3 deputies flanked him, their weapons trained on the cabin, but it was the other figures that made Samuel's blood run cold. 2 rough-looking men in leather coats, who had the hard eyes of professional killers, and a thin, pale man in a black suit who could only be Thomas Morrison, the boarding school administrator. "The girl is property of the territorial government." Thomas Morrison's voice was softer than his brother's, but carried a chill that made Samuel's skin crawl. "She has been entrusted to my care for proper education and civilizing. Her continued absence is a theft of government resources." Aiyana's hands clenched into fists. "He speaks of me like I am a horse to be broken," she whispered to Samuel. "In his mind, I am not human." Samuel felt a rage building in his chest that reminded him of his younger days, when Irish temper had gotten him into more fights than he could count. "You stay low," he told Aiyana. "If shooting starts, get to the root cellar no matter what I said before." But before either of them could move, a new sound cut through the night, the haunting call of a desert owl, followed by the answering cry of a coyote. Aiyana's eyes widened. "Naalnish," she breathed. "He signals the others." "They are in position." Samuel peered out the window and caught a glimpse of movement in the rocks above his property. The Apache warriors had used the darkness to surround Morrison's men, turning the hunters into the hunted. But Samuel knew this could go very wrong very quickly. If shooting started, innocent people would die on both sides. "I'm coming out," Samuel called to Morrison. "But I'm coming out alone, and I'm coming out talking." "Samuel." "No," Aiyana whispered urgently. "They will kill you the moment you step outside." "Maybe," Samuel agreed, "but if I don't try to defuse this, we'll have a massacre on our hands. Your brother and his men are good, but they're outnumbered and outgunned if this turns into a straight fight." Samuel opened the cabin door slowly, his hands visible and empty. The night air was cool against his skin, and he could smell the nervous sweat of horses and men. Several rifle barrels swung to track his movement, but no one fired. "That's far enough, McKenna," Sheriff Morrison barked. "Where is she?" "There's no girl here," Samuel said calmly. "Just me and my grief, and more loneliness than any man should have to bear." Thomas Morrison stepped forward, his pale face gleaming in the torchlight. "Mr. McKenna, I am Thomas Morrison, superintendent of the Apache Industrial School. The girl in question is a ward of the territorial government, placed in my care for her own good. She has been corrupted by savage influences and needs proper Christian guidance to become a productive member of society." "Funny," Samuel replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I've met a lot of so-called Christians in my time, and the ones who talk the most about salvation usually treat children the worst." One of the bounty hunters, a scarred man with dead eyes, spat into the dirt. "Enough talk. If the girl's in there, we'll find her. If she ain't, we'll know soon enough." "Nobody's searching my property without a warrant," Samuel said firmly. "And I don't see any judges out here with you." Sheriff Morrison's face darkened. "Don't push me, McKenna. I've got reasonable suspicion that you're harboring a fugitive. That's all the authority I need." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Samuel could feel the situation spiraling toward violence, and he knew that once the first shot was fired, there would be no stopping the bloodshed. Apache warriors would sweep down from the rocks. White men would die, and the cycle of revenge would continue. Then Aiyana's voice cut through the night like a blade. "I am here." She stepped out of the cabin, her chin held high, and her dark eyes blazing with defiance. The torchlight caught the red and white symbols painted on her face. War paint, Samuel realized, applied while he'd been talking to Morrison. "You want me?" she continued, her voice carrying across the desert with remarkable clarity. "Here I am. But know this, I am not the frightened child you took from her grandmother 4 years ago. I am Aiyana, daughter of the desert wind, keeper of the old ways, and I will not be caged again." Thomas Morrison stepped forward eagerly. "Alice, thank God. We've been so worried about you. Come along now, and we'll forget this unpleasant episode. You can return to your studies and—" "My name is not Alice," Aiyana interrupted, her voice sharp as a war cry. "Alice is dead. You killed her with your schools and your beatings and your lies about civilization. I am Aiyana, and I choose my own path." The bounty hunter with the scarred face raised his rifle. "Girl's clearly gone savage, probably diseased too. Might be kinder to—" He never finished the sentence. An arrow sprouted from his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. In the same instant, Naalnish and his 3 warriors materialized from the rocks like avenging spirits, their war cries echoing across the desert. Chaos erupted. Sheriff Morrison's men scrambled for cover, their horses rearing and screaming in panic. Samuel dove to shield Aiyana, pulling her behind the water trough as bullets began to fly. The Apache warriors moved like shadows, using the terrain and darkness to their advantage. "Cease fire!" Samuel roared above the gunfire. "Everyone stop shooting!" But the violence had taken on a life of its own. One of Morrison's deputies went down with an arrow in his thigh. Thomas Morrison cowered behind his horse, his face white with terror. The second bounty hunter was trying to get a clear shot at Naalnish, who seemed to flow like water between the rocks. Then Aiyana did something that froze everyone in place. She stood up in the middle of the gunfire, her arms spread wide, and began to sing in Apache. Her voice rose above the chaos, clear and haunting, carrying words that spoke of peace and understanding, even to those who couldn't understand the language. One by one, the guns fell silent. Apache warriors and white lawmen alike stared at the girl who stood fearless in the crossfire, her song filling the desert night with something that transcended the hatred and fear that had brought them all to this moment. Naalnish was the first to lower his weapon. He stepped out of the rocks, his eyes never leaving his sister's face. When he spoke, it was in English, his voice carrying the weight of years of pain and loss. "You would die for this, white man?" he asked Aiyana. "I would die for the right to choose my own path," she replied, still singing softly, "as our grandmother chose to trust the man who gave her water in her final hours." Sheriff Morrison started to raise his rifle again, but Thomas Morrison grabbed his arm. "Wait," the school administrator said, his voice shaking. "Let her speak." Aiyana looked at each man in turn. Her brother, Samuel, the Morrison brothers, the surviving bounty hunter. "You see enemies where there could be understanding. You see savage where there could be teacher. You see threat where there could be bridge between 2 worlds. She turned to face Thomas Morrison directly. "You tried to kill the Apache in me, but you cannot kill the wind. You cannot cage the desert. You cannot break the spirit that connects all living things." Thomas Morrison's face contorted with rage. "You are a child. You don't understand what's best for you. The Apache way is dead, finished. You must accept civilized life or what?" Naalnish's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You will beat her again? Lock her in darkness? Cut her hair and tell her that her grandmother's wisdom is evil?" The Apache warrior stepped closer, his hand on his knife. "I have seen what your civilization does to our children. I have seen the walking dead you send back to us, empty of everything that made them human." Sheriff Morrison raised his rifle again. "That's enough. You're all under arrest for what?" Samuel's voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "For defending a child? For refusing to let her be dragged back to a place where she was tortured in the name of education?" Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the lawman and the Apache family. "I've heard enough. Sheriff, you and your men are on my property without a warrant, threatening a girl who's done nothing but try to survive. Thomas Morrison, you're talking about a human being like she's livestock, and you bounty hunters, you're nothing but killers looking for an excuse to spill blood." The moment hung balanced on a knife's edge. Then slowly, Naalnish walked toward his sister. When he reached her, he knelt and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Little sister," he said softly, "I cannot protect you from your own choices, but I can respect them." He stood and looked at Samuel with eyes that held the wisdom of a people who had learned to endure. "You would truly stand with her, even knowing what it will cost you?" Samuel nodded without hesitation. "I would." Naalnish studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Then you are no longer enemy. You are family." As the 2 men clasped hands, the painted symbols on Samuel's door seemed to glow brighter in the torchlight, and for a moment, the desert held its breath. The dawn that followed the confrontation painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson, as if the desert itself was celebrating the fragile peace that had been won through courage and understanding. Samuel stood on his porch, watching Naalnish and his warriors prepare to leave. The Apache men moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to travel light and fast, but there was something different in their bearing now, a sense of resolution rather than the desperate alertness of the hunted. Sheriff Morrison and his men had departed in the dark hours before dawn, carrying their wounded and nursing injuries to both body and pride. Thomas Morrison had been the last to leave, his pale face twisted with frustrated rage, as he realized his authority meant nothing in the face of Aiyana's unbreakable spirit and her brother's protection. "The girl will be back," he had warned Samuel, before mounting his horse. When winter comes and she's cold and hungry, she'll remember the warm beds and regular meals at the school. They always do. But Samuel had seen the fire in Aiyana's eyes, the way she stood straighter after facing down her tormentors, and he knew Thomas Morrison was wrong. Some spirits could not be broken, only refined by adversity, until they shone like tempered steel. Now, as the sun climbed higher, Aiyana emerged from the cabin carrying a small bundle, her few possessions wrapped in a piece of cloth Samuel had given her. She had washed the war paint from her face, but the strength it had represented remained in the set of her shoulders and the steady gaze of her dark eyes. "You're leaving," Samuel said, though it wasn't really a question. He had known this moment would come, even as part of him hoped she might choose to stay. "For now," Aiyana replied, setting down her bundle. "My brother and I must speak with the elders on the reservation. There are others like me, children who have escaped from the schools, young people who want to learn the old ways but have nowhere safe to practice them." She gestured toward the mountains where Naalnish waited with his warriors. "We will create a place where Apache children can learn both worlds, the white man's reading and writing, but also our grandmother's wisdom. A place where no one has to choose between survival and their soul." Samuel nodded, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. "You'll need supplies, books, paper, basic tools for building." "We will manage," Aiyana began, but Samuel held up a hand. "I'm not offering charity," he said firmly. "I'm offering partnership. What you're talking about creating, it's going to need friends in the white community, people who can help protect it from men like the Morrisons." Aiyana studied his face, and Samuel saw the moment she understood what he was really offering. Not just supplies or occasional help, but a permanent alliance, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for too long. "You would do this?" she asked softly, even knowing the danger it would bring. Samuel thought of Margaret, of the dreams they'd shared for making their little corner of the desert a place where people could live in peace. "My wife always said this land was big enough for everyone, if people were willing to share it. Maybe it's time someone proved her right." Naalnish approached them, his weathered face thoughtful. In the morning light, Samuel could see the family resemblance between the siblings, the same intelligent eyes, the same quiet strength that spoke of deep waters running beneath calm surfaces. "Your offer is generous," Naalnish said to Samuel, his English careful but clear, "but you must understand what you are choosing. The government will not approve of what we plan to create. There will be officials who demand we stop, soldiers who threaten our children, politicians who claim we are a danger to their policies." "Let them come," Samuel replied. "I've been hiding in grief for 2 years, letting life pass me by. Maybe it's time I stood up for something that matters." Aiyana moved to the cabin door, placing her hand on the painted symbols that had started it all. "These will protect you," she said. "But more than that, they will remind you that you are no longer alone. Every sunrise that touches these symbols carries the prayers of our people for your safety and happiness." She turned back to Samuel, and for a moment, the composed young woman disappeared, revealing the child who had lost so much and found the courage to keep fighting. "Thank you," she said simply, "for honoring my grandmother, for treating me like a person instead of a problem, for showing me that not all white men see enemies when they look at Apache faces." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me, for painting those symbols on my door, for reminding me that there's more to life than just surviving." As Aiyana and Naalnish walked toward their horses, Samuel called after them, "Where will you build this school of yours?" Naalnish pointed toward a distant mesa that rose from the desert like a natural fortress. "There is a hidden valley behind Red Mesa, good water, natural shelter, and enough concealment to keep us safe while we grow strong. Our grandmother used to say it was blessed ground, a place where the spirits of all people could find peace. How will I find you when I have supplies to bring?" Aiyana smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Samuel had seen from her. "Follow the painted symbols. I will leave them on rocks along the trail, like my grandmother taught me. They will guide friends to our door and turn enemies away." The small group of Apache riders disappeared into the desert heat shimmer, but Samuel didn't feel the familiar ache of abandonment. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: purpose. He had work to do, supplies to gather, and a promise to keep. That afternoon he hitched his wagon and made the long journey to town. At the general store he bought extra flour, beans, salt pork, and writing materials, enough for his own needs with plenty to spare. When the curious shopkeeper asked about the large order, Samuel simply said he was planning to do some trading with the Apache. The shopkeeper's face darkened with disapproval, but Samuel had expected that. Word would spread quickly that Samuel McKenna was sympathetic to Indian causes, and there would be consequences. Some of his neighbors would shun him, business relationships would suffer, and men like Sheriff Morrison would watch him closely for any excuse to cause trouble. But as Samuel loaded his wagon and prepared for the journey home, he thought about Margaret and the life they'd planned together. She had always been the brave one, the one who saw possibility where others saw only problems. Now, finally, he was living up to the man she'd believed him to be. The painted symbols on his door glowed softly in the evening light as Samuel returned to his cabin, but they were no longer just protective wards. They were a promise, a covenant between people who had chosen understanding over fear, cooperation over conflict. As night fell over the desert, Samuel sat on his porch and watched the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Somewhere out there, Aiyana was helping to build a school where Apache children could learn to walk between two worlds without losing their souls. Somewhere out there, Naalnish was teaching young warriors that strength could be found in protection rather than revenge. And here, in a modest cabin marked with sacred symbols, a lonely Irish rancher was discovering that the best way to honor the dead was to serve the living. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant call of a coyote, but Samuel no longer felt alone. He was part of something larger now, a story that was just beginning, a bridge that would span the gap between worlds, one act of courage at a time. In the morning, he would begin gathering the supplies needed for their hidden school. He would face the consequences of his choices with the same quiet determination that had gotten him through his wife's death and 2 years of solitary grief. But tonight, he simply sat and listened to the desert sing its ancient songs, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the symbols on his door were glowing like beacons of hope in a world that desperately needed them. The painted door had become a gateway, not just to his cabin, but to a future where understanding might triumph over hatred, where children could learn without losing their heritage, and where a lonely man could find family among the most unlikely people. Samuel McKenna smiled as he rose to go inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new possibilities, and for the first time in years, he was looking forward to both.